The operation of the Ukrainian armed forces on the territory of the Belgorod region has been going on for several weeks. According to media sources close to Kiev, the Ukrainian army has advanced 3 to 4 kilometers in the Belgorod region. Intense clashes continue in the area of Popovka village, where unmanned aerial vehicles are used for shelling. The Ukrainian army is trying to land in the center of Belgorod. Here, we can see a military operation that we witnessed in Kursk Oblast. In Belgorod, the Ukrainians aim to distract the Russian forces and carry out cross-border operations. Kiev's army has so far been successful in this regard. According to Emil Kastehelmi, a military analyst at the Finnish company Blackbird Group, Ukrainian troops have broken through the first line of Russian defense. The Ukrainian armed forces not only broke through the Russian defense lines, but also managed to destroy the 2 most important logistical arteries in Belgorod. These arteries represented 2 of Russia's most strategic bridges in the region. So, how did the Ukrainians manage to destroy 2 bridges in Belgorod, where there were about 50,000 Russian troops? What kind of hell will tens of thousands of Russian soldiers fall into after the destruction of these 2 bridges? Where does the Ukrainian army intend to advance after Belgorod in the cross-border operation in the region? For answers to all these critical questions and much more, the video begins. But first, please don't forget to subscribe to our channel, turn on notifications, and give us a like to stay up to date with our content. So let's waste no time and go to Belgorod and take a closer look at what the Ukrainians have been up to lately. Ukrainian aviation carried out pinpoint strikes targeting bridges in the settlements of Grafovka and Nadezdovka in the Belgorod region. The Ukrainian Air Force destroyed 2 important bridges in the area, making it difficult to contain and resupply Russian troops. Both bridges span the town of Krasnaya Yaruga. It was in the areas where these bridges were located that the Russian command of the group was concentrated. Now, with the destruction of the bridges, the Russians are completely deadlocked. If the Ukrainian wing launches a renewed attack with drones and missiles on the deadlocked Russian forces in Belgorod, the situation could change dramatically. Russian forces in the area may not be able to withstand these attacks. With tens of thousands of Russian forces in Belgorod, the cost of a Ukrainian airstrike could be very heavy for the Kremlin. With both bridges removed, the Russian armed forces may not be able to supply their troops trapped in Belgorod with reinforcements or any military resources. So what does this mean for the Ukrainians? After destroying the 2 bridges, the Ukrainian army, which has already advanced 3 to 4 kilometers in the region, may have a chance to move much further inland from Belgorod. To this end, the Ukrainian armed forces are continuing their offensive fire. According to the governor of the region, Vyacheslav Gladkov, more than 20 villages in the Russian Belgorod region, located within 150 kilometers of the Ukrainian border, have come under attack. The Ukrainian military has not officially acknowledged these operations. So why Belgorod? The offensive by Ukrainian forces appears to be in response to their recent losses in Kursk, the Russian region adjacent to Belgorod, where they captured more than 1,000 square kilometers last August. In recent weeks, a new Russian offensive backed by North Korean troops had pushed the Ukrainians back to the border. With the weather improving and the Trump administration pressing for a ceasefire, both Russia and Ukraine are aiming to make gains along the 1,000-kilometer front line. The Kiev regime also intends to advance with its military power in Belgorod. In other words, the Ukrainian army is trying to clamp down on Russian forces and North Korean troops from 2 sides. Russia, on the other hand, is trying to respond to the alleged Ukrainian offensive operations in Belgorod. The Ukrainian General Staff announced that a few days ago, in the northeastern city of Kharkiv, a Russian drone strike injured soldiers being treated at a military hospital. Elsewhere in the city, 2 people were killed and 25 injured. Such attacks on civilian infrastructure and public spaces are unlikely to stop the Ukrainians. The attacks on Belgorod are expected to intensify every day. The aim is to seize and hold Russian territory and to reduce pressure on Ukrainian troops in the Kursk region and the neighboring Sumy region. But Russia seems to have learned in advance about the Ukrainian side's intentions, which include Sumy. Ukrainian Commander-in-Chief Oleksandr Syrsky recently reported that Russian troops are trying to launch attacks on Sumy. The Russian Defense Ministry claimed that its troops had taken a small settlement in the region. The aim of the Russians was to prevent the Ukrainian army from passing through Sumy. At the moment, possible additional military supply from Sumy seems risky for Ukraine. Russian artillery is allegedly deployed in high ground northwest of Belgorod. If Ukraine makes a move and tries to advance through Sumy, Russian artillery units may seize the opportunity. What about the ceasefire? Negotiations on a limited ceasefire, brokered by the US with some fanfare, are making little progress. The Kremlin has added several conditions for a ceasefire in the Black Sea that are unacceptable to Ukraine and its European allies. Moscow and Kiev accuse each other of targeting energy facilities despite an agreement earlier this month that they would end it. Kremlin spokesman Dmitry Peskov said Russia reserves the right not to abide by the ban on attacks on the energy sector, which Kiev has repeatedly violated. Grigory Karasin, one of the Russian negotiators, said he did not expect a general ceasefire agreement until at least the end of this year. Grigory Karasin said that the talks in Riyadh had not led to anything radical and that no breakthrough should be expected. He added that progress could be expected at best at the end of the year. So which side is more willing not to accept the ceasefire? The Russian authorities have once again shown how incapable they are of complying with any diplomatic request to finally achieve peace on both sides. Since yesterday, the Russian military has again shelled Ukraine's energy grid. Ukrainian Foreign Minister Andriy Sybiha, as well as another member of the military, confirmed the attacks on Ukraine's energy grid. One of the agreements made with the US after the talks in Riyadh was to refrain from attacks on energy infrastructure. However, Russia continues to violate this agreement. Energy facilities in the cities of Kherson and Kharkiv and in Poltava Oblast have already been damaged. And this morning, another Russian attack damaged a power plant in Kherson, leaving 45,000 people without electricity. Russian Deputy Foreign Minister Sergei Ryabkov claimed on April 1st that the Trump administration is attempting some kind of plan to first achieve a ceasefire and then move on to other models and plans to end the war. Given that Russia wants to capture a few more cities and towns before agreeing to anything, any model other than the Russian model seems to be better for ending this war. One of the cities the Kremlin wants most is Zaporizhia. As far as Zaporizhia is concerned, it continues to be bombed every day, as almost every major Ukrainian city is. From what we understand, if Russia captures these cities, the course of the war could change completely. The only realistic cities left could be Kiev and Kharkiv, as well as Sumy. These three cities may not be able to account for the sustainability of their population without external intervention by the Allies. There are also reports that Russia is planning to capture Dnipro using the tactics of additional waves of troops. But the Russian armed forces have a big problem. Unless Russia finds a way to end this war quickly, the chances of catastrophic economic and military collapse will steadily increase over time. Apparently, the Russians don't seem to realize how deadly dangerous tuberculosis is. Sending infected soldiers back to the trenches will cause the disease to spread like wildfire. Tuberculosis has claimed more than 1 billion lives, making it the deadliest disease in human history. In general, disease and lack of food have been more powerful killers than bullets in most major wars. The same conditions prevail in the war between Ukraine and Russia. Sanitary conditions in the Russian trenches continue to be appalling. Tuberculosis is spreading among Russian military groups. Ukraine will continue to hit fuel trucks and supply routes to worsen this situation for the Russian army. So Russia is in for some really tough times ahead. But will Russia agree to peace when the situation is so critical? As speculation grows about possible negotiations to end Russia's occupation of Ukraine, it is important to understand the nature of the war that Vladimir Putin launched nearly 3 years ago. Most importantly, this is not a traditional territorial war that can be resolved by offering limited territorial concessions. Putin's goals are much more ambitious. He is waging the current war to undermine the existing international security architecture and replace it with a new world order in which a handful of great powers can dominate their neighbors. Since launching a full-scale invasion of Ukraine in February 2022, Putin has repeatedly outlined his vision of a multipolar world order that would reverse the dominance of the Cold War and create a world divided into spheres of influence. By invading Ukraine and challenging the sanctity of borders, Putin aims to remove a central pillar of today's global security system and normalize the use of military force in international relations. If his efforts are perceived as successful, it will set a disastrous precedent that will embolden authoritarian regimes around the world. Putin's dream of building a new world order is reflected in his effort to hold bilateral talks with the United States to discuss the fate of Ukraine and Europe without Ukraine or Europe's participation. He wants to show that sovereignty is negotiable and send the message that some nations are more equal than others. The consequences of this approach could be disastrous for both Ukraine and Europe as a whole. The world order that Putin hopes to usher in will be governed by the laws of the geopolitical jungle and defined by distrust and aggression. Armed conflicts will proliferate worldwide as the previously accepted rules of international relations are replaced by the principle that might makes right. The unprecedented global economic prosperity of the last 3 decades will be threatened by rising barriers to trade and record defense spending. The only obvious beneficiaries will be countries like Russia, which will seek to adopt revisionist or expansionist agendas. The international security situation is now so serious and so escalated that it can no longer be resolved by appeasing Russia or seeking some kind of compromise peace. Instead, Russia must lose in Ukraine and be seen to lose. This is not the case at the moment. On the contrary, Putin is more confident than ever of victory and sees no reason to end the war. He is flexing his muscles around the world and has managed to build a coalition of authoritarian powers such as China, Iran, and North Korea that support the war in Ukraine and share Moscow's goal of overthrowing the existing world order. Putin's troops on the front lines may be sick, but it doesn't matter to him. The Russian leader is only interested in winning in Ukraine. The loss of millions of Russian soldiers' lives to achieve this is of little concern to Putin. On the domestic front, Putin has managed to put the Russian economy in a state of war and found new partners to compensate for the collapse of relations with the West. He is clearly preparing for a long war and is counting on a lack of Western resolve. To stop the war, Putin needs to be convinced that continuing the occupation of Ukraine would be catastrophic for Russia. This requires a series of measures aimed at weakening Russia's position both economically and militarily. In fact, Russia's economic outlook is already deteriorating as a result of the war and could become much more serious if Western leaders take the necessary steps. It is clear that more coordination is needed between the US, the UK, the EU, and other countries sanctioning Russia's war effort. While the enforcement of existing sanctions is insufficient, tougher measures are needed to target intermediaries. Economic difficulties alone will not bring Putin to the negotiating table. He must also be forced to face the prospect of military defeat. This will require a major change of thinking among Ukraine's partners. At the moment, Ukraine is forced to fight a defensive war of attrition with the aim of inflicting unacceptable losses on the Russians. But Putin clearly has a very high tolerance for casualties and can also draw on large reserves of unused manpower to replenish the depleted ranks of his army. If the current war of attrition continues, Putin could resort to these tactics. Instead, Ukraine must be equipped to defeat Russia on the battlefield. The Ukrainian army has repeatedly proven its ability to defeat Russia, but it currently lacks the military capabilities to turn local victories into a war-winning position. This needs to change. Western fears of escalation mean that Kiev is still deprived of a wide range of weapons and faces restrictions on its ability to defend itself. As a result of this overly cautious approach, the Kremlin is able to wage a full-scale war against Ukraine with little fear of major counterattacks from within Russia. Putin also has overwhelming advantages in firepower, including a much larger and more advanced air force. No NATO member state would even consider going to war without sufficient air power, but that is exactly what Ukraine is now expected to do. Until now, the West has been arming Ukraine to survive. Putin will not end the occupation until he is convinced that Western leaders are determined to arm Ukraine for victory. Ukraine's military requirements are well known. The only thing missing is the political will to act. This means providing large quantities of combat aircraft, long-range missiles, armored vehicles, and artillery, as well as significantly improved drone and electronic warfare capabilities. By providing Ukraine with sufficient military assistance, the West can force Putin to rethink the current war and at the same time create a strong deterrent force capable of preventing further Russian aggression. Anything less will only create a pause in hostilities that Putin will use to rearm and prepare for the next phase of his war against the West. The price of stopping Russia in Ukraine is high, but it will pale in comparison to the costs of a new authoritarian world order if Putin's invasion is allowed to succeed. The Ukrainian side is still trying to prevent this scenario from happening. As we mentioned in the video, the Ukrainian armed forces are seeking to deepen the operation in Belgorod to distract the Russians. But in order for the Ukrainians to achieve this, in order to easily blow up the Russian military logistics arteries in Belgorod, they need military resources. Here, too, the influence of the West re-emerges. The combination of the U.S. reopening military and intelligence support to the Ukrainian army and the West's military and financial enrichment of Kiev could create a force that Russian forces will be unable to stop. For generations, Russia has been able to impose its imperial propaganda on the international masses by silencing Ukrainians and misleadingly portraying them as an integral part of Russia's own historical heartland. But the time has come for the overall balance to shift. Since February 2022, international perceptions of the relationship between Russia and Ukraine have undergone a radical transformation as global audiences witness the brutality of the Russian aggression and the resolve of Ukraine's national defense. The war launched by Vladimir Putin has ripped hundreds of thousands from their lives and turned millions into refugees. It has also destroyed the Kremlin myth that Russians and Ukrainians are one people. If the Ukrainians succeed in their military operation in Belgorod, following Kursk, it may be only a matter of time before many more of the myths propagated by Russia are also consigned to history. Thank you for watching.